The phone rang through the dim warmth of a French chateau that had been repurposed as a headquarters. Outside, the summer light slanted across manicured lawns and into a room where maps lay pinned and pinned again, a landscape of colored pens and pencil lines that tried to hold a continent together. It was July 1, 1944, 25 days after Allied forces had come ashore in Normandy, and Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt picked up the receiver. On the other end, from the Wolf's Lair deep in East Prussia, was Wilhelm Keitel, the chief of the OKW. The question was simple and, in its context, terrible. What now? Rundstedt's reply, as reported, cut like a blade through the static of a collapsing command system. "End the war, you idiots." The sentence landed in a silence that carried the weight of months of misjudgment, missed opportunities, and institutional blindness. It was not, in the narrow sense, a formal strategy. It was an epitaph for a single opportunity, the last coherent chance a professional soldier could see to avert total annihilation on a Western front that was closing around Germany. That phrase, blunt, exasperated, final, became a hinge on which not only one career, but a whole chain of events turned. To understand why a man whose lifetime was forged in Prussian barracks would speak like that into the telephone, you must step back through a career, through doctrine and personalities, and back into those long June days when tides and fuel and radio messages decided more than tactics. You must also look at a command culture that made truth dangerous. Gerd von Rundstedt was, by the summer of 1944, the embodiment of an old guard German professional soldier. Born into a military family and formed in the crucible of the Imperial Officer Corps, he had earned his place as a senior commander long before the Nazis consolidated their control over Germany. He commanded with the habits and assumptions of someone who believed in the primacy of maneuver, in the careful preservation of striking strength, and in the slow arithmetic of logistics and reserves. His record in 1939 and 1940, campaigns that, for the German army, had seemed to vindicate a doctrine of decisive operational reserves and sweeping counterstrokes, had given him an authority that later generations of officers still acknowledged. That authority, however, was entangled with compromise. Rundstedt accepted posts under the Nazi regime. He served in campaigns whose conduct and orders can't be separated from a government that carried out and sanctioned criminal policies. He shared responsibility for decisions and transmissions that would be judged harshly in post-war assessments. Historical accounts stress with necessary sobriety that professional competence existed alongside political complicity. This is not a story of clean, apolitical mastery. It is a study in how trained institutions operate under corrosive political control. By the spring of 1944, the immediate problem for Germany was not personality alone, but a map of material constraints and operational misjudgments. The Allied plan for the invasion of Western Europe, Operation Overlord, had been the product of a massive logistical enterprise. Amphibious fleets assembled in the English Channel. Follow-up convoys carried fuel and men and armored division components. Airborne troops hammered at inland objectives. Churchill's and Eisenhower staffs coordinated the slow, deliberate machinery of supply. Where the Allies had one concentrated advantage, it was in a simple arithmetic. Once a lodgment was achieved, their sea lines and air superiority allowed them to feed soldiers, tanks, and petrol into a narrow front far more efficiently than German systems could respond. The early hours of June 6, 1944, had been chaotic, but the Allies' combined arms coordination and the sheer density of their material mattered more than any single moment of confusion. A trickle of paratroopers stormed beaches, and the arrival of follow-up divisions created the foundation for a larger weight to press westward. Allied deception measures had worked. German command had been led to expect larger operations elsewhere, and the dispersal of defensive forces along the French coast doubled the problem. The Normandy lodgment, once it held through the first days, transformed from a gamble into a sustained siege of logistics that favored the attacker. From the German vantage, several factors made counterstroke difficult. Their air force had been thinned by years of war and attrition. Germany's industrial system and transportation networks were under sustained pressure from Allied bombing, making the flow of petrol and replacement tanks unreliable. Critically, the German practice of holding armored divisions in central reserves, intended for decisive counterattacks, collided with a new tactical reality: the Allied ability to seal ports and produce a steady stream of reinforcements. Cherbourg, deep in the Cotentin Peninsula, had been a strategic prize. Once its capture and repair were underway, the Allies' logistical advantage only increased. In short, the window for a decisive German counterpunch, if it had ever been wide, was narrowing by the day. Into this operational squeeze stepped a debate as much about temperament as about tactics. On one side stood Erwin Rommel, commander of Army Group B, whose recent wartime experience had convinced him that the Allies would win if they were allowed to land and consolidate. Rommel argued, with urgency born of a commander watching the coast, that armored units should be deployed close to the beaches, ready to strike the moment an assault began. From his observation posts along the Atlantic Wall, he had seen the logic in response that placed emphasis on immediate interdiction and crushing the lodgment in its infancy. On the other side stood Rundstedt and commanders trained in a more classical conception of operational art. They argued for depth, for holding armor back in mobile reserves inland where it could be maneuvered for a decisive blow once the main enemy efforts had been fixed and identified. That approach drew on earlier German victories where organized reserves had been thrown in at the critical moment to sever an enemy's cohesion. Those men who supported the reserve doctrine pointed to logistics. Armored units were fuel-hungry and required a secure line of movement. Exposing them too close to the beachhead risked being pinned or destroyed piecemeal by Allied air power and naval gunfire. Both positions had coherence when viewed in isolation. Their clash made sense given the unique physics of an invasion from across a sea in the age of air supremacy. What broke the debate, however, was less intellectual than institutional. Above both commanders loomed Adolf Hitler, whose personal command style had become the chief structural constraint on German military responsiveness. In the months and years leading up to June 1944, Hitler had transformed the decision-making architecture of the Wehrmacht by retaining direct control over the movement of strategic armored reserves. Panzer divisions were no longer freely committed by theater commanders. Each movement required explicit approval from the Führer or his closest deputies. That centralization turned tanks into political instruments rather than tactical tools. The practical consequence of that centralization became evident on the morning of June 6. Reports filtered in from the coast that an invasion was underway, yet authorization to release the Panzer Reserve to throw mobile force into the fray did not immediately follow. Competing information, the fear of a feint, and an expectation that the true landing might be elsewhere led to delays measured in hours that would, in their aggregate, cost more. Allied air control over the channel and the immediate area made it perilous to move large armored formations in daylight along exposed roads. When movement was finally attempted, the Luftwaffe's diminished capacity meant German columns were vulnerable to strafing and the interdiction of fuel supplies, making timely maneuver even less probable. Central to this dynamic were the organizational incentives that favored good news and discouraged candor. Officers who brought unwelcome news risked career stagnation or being sidelined. Those who painted a brighter, less alarming picture often rose. An institution that rewarded flattering assessments was bound to warp its reality. So as the Allies built up men and material in July, those who told small verities were kept at post, and those who told the big, ugly truth that the balance had shifted decisively were treated as defeatists. Rundstedt, who had spent decades valuing a clear-eyed assessment of force and supply, found himself against a system where saying, "This is unsustainable," felt not only pessimistic, but professionally dangerous. By the time June shifted to July, the Normandy battlefield had acquired a geography of attrition. Allied naval guns could pulverize a roadside column. Allied air power could keep the German transport system on edge. The French hedgerows, bocage, produced a slow, bloody grind that favored attackers who could bring increasing numbers to bear. Crucially, the Allies were feeding their force through a growing port infrastructure. Cherbourg, though damaged, was being repaired and used. Each ship that docked, each train that ran from a captured pier, increased the Allies' staying power. Rundstedt watched this in the way he had always watched military problems, as a combination of numbers and options. He saw the attrition on German armored crews, the irreplaceable loss of trained personnel more than the hulks of tanks. He saw how soon the Wehrmacht might have no realistic counter. Rommel, pointing to the beaches from his defensive lines, noted that if the Allies were allowed to firmly establish themselves, the kind of mobile counterstroke Rundstedt favored would be impossible. The tactical calculus thus became a bitter argument over what would be lost if either policy were pursued. There were other factors. Allied deception operations, most notably the Fortitude program, had successfully convinced Hitler that the main Allied blow might come at Pas-de-Calais, not at Normandy. German intelligence, compromised and misled, prioritized reinforcements for the wrong sectors. The German High Command continued to treat Normandy as one offensive among many, rather than the singular pivot that the Allies were building into. Information moved in fits and starts. Channels were clogged by protocol and enhanced by fear. The mechanized world that should have delivered swift replies instead produced bureaucratic delays. Each hour of hesitation allowed the Anglo-American juggernaut to fatten itself on supplies. Rundstedt had a pedigree that made his voice carry weight. He had commanded armies in campaigns that had once been models of operational efficiency. He had been entrusted with responsibility for the defense of the Atlantic coast. But he was not indifferent to the political realities. He was, in many ways, a man attempting to apply traditional soldiering to a politicized war. More than once he recorded private doubts about the political interference that eroded military efficacy. He had also, as the record must acknowledge, been part of a system that transmitted and sometimes executed orders with criminal implications. The moral stain of certain wartime directives cannot be erased by professional competence. That tension between the craft of war and the moral responsibility of obeying a criminal state's command would shadow how history remembered him. On the morning of July 1, the landscape was one of frustration sharpened into fatalism. Rundstedt's staff laid out maps showing where divisions were thin, where roads bloated with refugee columns and wrecked vehicles slowed everything. Reports came of armor that could not move because of a lack of fuel. Messages noted that Luftwaffe sorties were too few to clear the skies. Intelligence suggested that Allied supplies would soon be arriving at a rate that German infrastructure could not match. The operational window to assemble a decisive reserve, concentrated, and strike a blow before the Allies consolidated seemed to be closing. From Rundstedt's vantage, time itself had become an enemy. When Keitel's voice asked, in formal, brittle tones, "What is to be done?" it was not merely a search for a tactical plan. It was the moment a professional officer could say to the political military apparatus that the game had shifted. Rundstedt's answer, later relayed by those present and repeated in post-war recollections, was a sentence at once blunt and sorrowful. "End the war, you idiots." It was a line that carried multiple registers. At its simplest, it was an assessment. The strategic balance in the West had tilted. Continued fighting would produce more death and more destruction without altering the eventual outcome. At another level, it was a condemnation of a command system that had, through its incentives and centralizations, removed the possibility of timely, candid advice. And at a moral level, hard and uncomfortable, it was the statement of a soldier who, witnessing ruin, recommended the only course that could prevent greater loss, even at the cost of political defeat. That single moment, a curt phrase on a telephone, did not stand alone. It was the culmination of doctrine colliding with modern combined arms, of political control grinding against professional military judgment, and of an industrial war where supply lines and ports mattered as much as tactical genius. It was also a moment when truth met consequence. Saying the truth in an environment that punished bad news carried the inevitable result. The speaker risked removal. 2 days after that call, Rundstedt was relieved of command. The official orders used the euphemisms familiar to hierarchical organizations: reassignments, transfers, retirements. The effect was unmistakable. One of the Army's last senior voices of classical professional military judgment was pushed out at a moment when honesty should have been prized. What replaced him was a leadership more tightly bound to the political center, more likely to offer the Führer the news he wanted. The act of dismissal served as a message to others. Candor could be lethal to a career. The consequences of that pattern would ripple outward. Within weeks and months, the German command structure would be punctured by assassination attempts, forced suicides, and a succession of commanders whose fates underscored the murderous logic of a regime intolerant of dissent. Erwin Rommel, whose seriousness about the coast had made him both a popular figure and a target, would be compelled to take his own life after being implicated in plots against Hitler. Gunther von Kluge, another senior commander who succeeded Rundstedt briefly, ended his life amid scandal and collapse. The July 20 plot to kill Hitler, an event born of frustration with a command that seemed incapable of rational self-preservation, would explode in the very rooms that had once received reports from the front. But that cascade of political purges and personal tragedies was still in the near future on July 1. At the present moment, the more immediate object was the battlefield itself. Across the Normandy plain, the Allies were pressing for a breakthrough. British and Canadian forces strained in the east. American troops sought to crack the bocage and open lanes for armor. Operation Cobra, still under preparation, promised the kind of concentrated thrust that could exploit the logistic swelling of Allied power. If the Germans could not find a way to mass and maneuver in time, the front would tear open. Every message that left Rundstedt's Chateau carried the sensation that the map was about to be redrawn. What makes Rundstedt's line so provocative is not merely its insult or its despair. It is the recognition embedded in that sentence that an institution had become incapable of self-correction. The war would continue for 10 more brutal months after that exchange. In those months, field commanders and private soldiers alike would face the consequences of strategic delay, of withheld reserves, of fractured communications, and of leadership choices that prioritized loyalty over truth. The human cost was enormous. Men killed in places they could not have changed, and civilians swept by the tumults of liberation and retribution. Yet, even as the military consequences unfolded, historians and moralists have asked the harder questions about responsibility. Does professional expertise under a criminal government excuse the servant of that state from culpability? Can one separate the skillful handling of divisions from the purpose they serve? The answer, necessarily complex, refuses clean absolutions. Rundstedt's actions must be read in the combined light of competence and complicity. A soldier who knew how to move armies and also one who operated within and sometimes enabled a regime that issued criminal orders. His blunt counsel on July 1 therefore needs to be understood not as a moral exoneration, but as an expression of professional despair, and perhaps an attempt at mitigation. Within the chateau that evening, the maps remained, pens half pulled and pencil marks still bright. The telephone had been put back into its cradle. Officers shuffled papers and tried to make the best of what they could. Orders eroded into telegrams, and telegrams turned into the mechanical rhythms of an organization trying to stay alive, while knowing, if tacitly, that its freedoms of action were narrowing. For the men in those rooms, the next days would demand judgment calls. For the officers at the top, the political calculus of who to favor and whom to silence was as dangerous as any battlefield. If one looks at the larger theater of war, the Normandy campaign had changed the future of Europe. The Allied buildup across the Channel ensured that even successful German tactical actions would have to occur under the steady attrition of logistic superiority. The old military maxim, that time can be an ally, had been turned against Germany. Time now strengthened the Allies. The question that Rundstedt posed to Keitel was therefore not merely rhetorical. It implied a recognition that the institutional architecture of decision-making, shaped by centralized power and intolerance of truth, had turned strategic options into moral dilemmas. For historians, the moment is illuminating because it compresses into a few words the collision of character, doctrine, and institutional design. For leaders and organizations today, it serves as a cautionary parable. Systems that punish candor will starve themselves of the best advice precisely when they most need it. But even that lesson must be held alongside reminders that the men involved were participants in a criminal enterprise whose aims and methods can never be lost behind the tactical debates. If this account resonates with the kind of deep dive into contested moments you find useful, consider liking and subscribing. There are more episodes in which small decisions at the top created vast consequences on the ground, and this story is only beginning to show its edges. In the days immediately following Rundstedt's dismissal, the battlefield itself reacted in predictable and unpredictable ways. German commanders wrangled with orders as communications lagged and as the weather and Allied air patrols cut movement windows thin. The Allied lodgment continued to grow teeth. Supply lines hardened, armored units arrived, and small tactical breakthroughs promised the sort of operational shock that could unhinge a defensive system already strained to its limits. For the German side, the pathway back to coherent, concentrated counterattack grew more arduous with each passing convoy that reached Omaha and Utah. Each repaired jetty that swallowed tonnage, and each air sortie that made movement during daylight a perilous gamble. Reports from multiple sectors pointed to the same structural failures: fuel shortages, shortages of trained crews, a lack of local air cover, and the tyranny of terrain that made mechanized response slow and predictable. Orders from Berlin, when they came, were couched in political priorities rather than military necessity, and the result was a series of partial measures that solved no central problem. A concentration of force, to be decisive, required authorization and time that the Germans no longer possessed. At the operational center of this failure was a recurring theme: the psychological toll on commanders who understood the arithmetic but lacked the institutional means to act on it. Rommel, who had argued forcefully for a close-in defense, watched beaches he had tried to fortify turn into gateways. Klug, who succeeded Rundstedt briefly, was thrust into a role where every decision was a chess move with a clock running faster than any human could manage comfortably. The political persecution that awaited dissenters made decisive thinking hazardous, for to be right and removed was a cautionary reward. This is the context in which "End the war, you idiots" must be understood, not only as a moral outburst, but as a symptom of a command system that had robbed itself of flexibility. The line did not merely close an argument, it exposed a procedural disease. An army built on reserve doctrine was hamstrung by centralized control. A command that punished honesty ensured that bad assessments traveled upward while truth traveled downward with extraordinary difficulty. In such a system, skillful officers were caricatured as alarmists, cautious officers were silenced, and bold action became the prerogative of those willing to disobey or those already out of favor. July 1944 became a month of rapid unraveling. The German strategic reserves, the bread and butter of operational recovery, were made inert by orders, uncertainty, or the means to move being compromised by Allied interdiction. The Allied breakout that would come in the weeks after relied on a predictable set of advantages: mass, maneuver, and the ability to maintain supply across a maritime lifeline. The German problem was one of caught mobility. Even when they knew where to strike, the resources to strike were often out of reach. At the same time, on the political front, Hitler's mood had not favored the admission of dire reality. Reports tailored to please the Führer tended to find favor. The flow of information became skewed by fear, politics, and by the very human instinct to survive within a lethal hierarchy. Keitel, the man who had relayed Rundstedt's words to the Führer's circle, was himself an actor caught between truth and survival. His presence on that July 1 call symbolized how the vertical chain of command had become a chain of command with crushed links. Messages lost their fidelity as they traveled upward. The days immediately following, the ones that would be narrated in telegrams and later in courtrooms and memoirs, are the subject of dispute and anguish. Officers who had tried to argue for one course or another found themselves judged not only by battlefield outcomes, but by how they navigated a regime that rewarded loyalty over clarity. The punishment of Rundstedt, a professional of long record, was a warning more than a reprimand. It was an institutional reinforcement of a logic that would have catastrophic consequences, a military compelled to prefer flatter satisfactions to hard truths. This is the point at which the story opens wider, not to close but to complicate. The battlefield consequences of June and July 1944 are visible in pins and scars on maps. Ports seized, roads scarred by armor, villages burned in the crossfire. But the deeper map is institutional, a picture of how centralized control, coupled with incentives that punish truth, can hollow out the capacity to respond. Rundstedt's exasperated sentence is a symptom of that hollowness, an appeal that was more plea than plan. As the summer of 1944 progressed, the Allied forces found ways to exploit the small margins they had been given. The German side, deprived of straightforward channels for decisive action and hemmed in by political imperatives, increasingly resorted to ad hoc measures and to commanders who could be trusted to obey rather than to those who could be trusted to speak plainly. The resulting dynamic, obedience in exchange for survival, shortened options and hardened certainties. For men who had been trained to measure risk in troop formations and tonnage of fuel, the new calculus of political favor introduced a different corrosive variable. The narrative of July 1 is therefore as much a tale of organizational pathology as of personal despair. A field marshal saying, in effect, that the only sane choice was to concede defeat is the most precise kind of indictment of the system that made such a sentence possible. It is one thing for a soldier to concede defeat in private. It is another to speak it aloud and be removed for the sin of candor. The latter choice reveals a structure that degrades the very qualities, honesty, prudence, clarity of judgment, that military institutions should prize most. The story of Rundstedt and the days that followed cannot be told without acknowledging the moral complexities. His competence did not erase the moral dimension of serving a criminal regime, nor did his dismissal absolve the regime of its political crimes. What it did do is serve as a case study in how institutions collapse, not in a single dramatic failure, but through a succession of choices that reward safety of position over fidelity to fact. The July 1 call, now famous for its raw, almost exasperated tone, is less a moment of theatricality and more a symptom of a deeper malaise. What happened next? The dismissals, the attempted coups, the forced deaths of senior commanders, and the inexorable westward push of Allied forces is the story of how a war, already costly, became ever more destructive when courage to speak honestly was stifled. It is also a warning about the costs of organizational incentives that favor conformity. In military terms, one might say that when the feedback loops that correct error are broken, performance degrades.
In human terms, the degradation takes the form of lives extinguished under orders that might have been different had truth been welcome. As the narrative moves forward, the reader will see the ways in which that single sentence on the telephone rippled outward, into dismissals, into plots, into new commanders who were more pliant than prescient. For now, the maps lie open, the pens are still, and the telephone in Rundstedt's chateau has been set down. The urgency of the field remains. The cost of institutional silence will soon become clearer to anyone charting the months ahead. The pins on the map would not stay put. Once the Allies cut through the bocage and found lanes for armor, once ports were patched and tonnage began to arrive with a steady, almost industrial rhythm, the front began to redraw itself in ways the old tactics had not anticipated. Operation Cobra, the concentrated American punch planned for late July, was one of those moments. It would not be a single clean breakthrough, but a violent, widening seam through which the entire Western Front would have to be rethought. For the officers left in the chateau after Rundstedt's dismissal, the question was no longer merely what to do. It was how to cope with an institutional architecture that made action slow and truth costly. Operation Cobra opened on July 25, 1944, with a hurricane of bombs and artillery intended to smash German defenses near St. Lo and create a corridor for mobile formations. Within days, the German front began to bend and then tear. American armored columns poured through the gaps, exploiting the kind of operational depth the Wehrmacht had once prized for itself. The result was not only a tactical loss at a single point, but a systemic unraveling. German units, already short on fuel and trained crews, found their lines exposed and their rear areas threatened. The once vaunted Central Reserves, the panzer divisions that might have reversed a local blow, were either immobilized by lack of authorization, interdicted by Allied air attacks, or simply absent in strength due to earlier losses. As the Americans surged, the logistical reality that Rundstedt had warned about became visible in mundane, brutal ways. Trains and roads became targets, the movement of fuel and ammunition slowed. Replacements did not exist in the numbers required. The capture and repair of Cherbourg and other ports increased Allied throughput, allowing not only men and tanks, but repair crews, spare parts, and engineering equipment to flow into the lodgment. Each repaired jetty and each coaxed train meant yet another day the Germans could not claw back. From a purely operational standpoint, the German failure was the sum of attrition and blocked initiative. But its human story was told in other forms. Exhausted regimental commanders who pleaded for clear directives. Colonels who improvised counterattacks with what they had and were punished for them. Staff officers who learned to bend reports to the taste of those above them. The feedback mechanisms that should have corrected error failed because the incentives rewarded comfort and compliance. In practical terms, this meant that commanders often delayed or diluted bad news, and Hitler's inner circle, insulated and defensive, received a skewed version of the battlefield. Decisions made on truncated or sanitized information predictably produced poor outcomes. The collapse in Normandy accelerated the political crisis inside Germany's military leadership. The July 20 plot, the most dramatic manifestation of internal resistance within the officer corps, grew in part out of the same despair that produced Rundstedt's exasperated council. Colonel Claus von Stauffenberg and his co-conspirators believed that removing Hitler and establishing a more pragmatic government might end the war and save Germany from complete disintegration. The bomb placed in the Wolf's Lair on July 20, 1944, failed to kill Hitler, but did blow a hole in the myth of invulnerability that had protected the Führer. The conspiracy's failure unleashed a wave of reprisals that cut across the Wehrmacht and the civilian bureaucracy. Thousands were arrested, many executed or sent to concentration camps, and the remaining senior officers were cowed by the fear that any whiff of dissent would cost them their lives. Those reprisals reached men like Rommel and Klug in different ways. Günther von Klug, who had briefly assumed command after Rundstedt, was implicated, at least by association and by some accounts through his private doubts, in the shadow of conspiratorial thinking.
Overwhelmed by scandal and the sudden collapse of administrative cohesion, Klug took his own life on August 19, 1944, a death that underlines the personal toll exacted by a regime that brooked no meaningful divergence from a singular political line. Erwin Rommel, celebrated by many as a tactical genius and by others as complicit in a criminal system, became another victim of the same brutal logic. When his alleged involvement in anti-Hitler conversations surfaced, he was offered a grim choice: face public humiliation and likely execution for treason, or accept a dignified death with the secrecy that would protect his family. On October 14, 1944, Rommel died from cyanide, his end staged by the very regime he had once served. These deaths did not heal the Wehrmacht's wounds. They intensified the climate of fear and removed figures whose candor, however imperfect, had been part of the professional conversation inside senior ranks. What followed was not a neat sequence of cause and effect, but a complex weave of operational failure and political vengeance. The dismissal of candid, experienced commanders removed some of the Wehrmacht's intellectual ballast. In place of veteran generals who took pains to measure logistics and assess risk, the political center increasingly entrusted key commands to officers whose value lay in obedience rather than judgment. Obedience in such a structure is a poor substitute for competence. That was the nature of the strategic sclerosis that Rundstedt had sought to name. By sidelining those who would speak plainly and by privileging those who fit a political profile, the system ensured that early warnings about fuel, training, and mobility would be muffled or ignored. The Allied advance that summer and autumn turned German military problems into crises of movement and space. Paris, liberated with a mixture of internal uprising and external advance on August 25, 1944, was a symbolic blow whose political consequences were as significant as its military ones. The fall of Paris signaled that much of northern France was effectively beyond German control. For German commanders, it meant a shrunken operational theater and an increase in refugees and supply problems as the population fled ahead of advancing Allied columns. The war's center of gravity had moved inexorably west to east in Europe, and Germany now faced the very kind of strategic position for which Rundstedt had feared. The capacity to wage mobile counterstrokes was being replaced by localized, desperate attempts to hold collapsing lines. Winter offered the Germans a chance, or so some believed, for a decisive counteroffensive. Hitler seized on the idea that a bold stroke in the Ardennes might split the Allied forces, capture Antwerp, and force a negotiated settlement. The offensive that began on December 16, 1944, known to history as the Battle of the Bulge, was audacious and initially surprised the Allies. Yet it was born of a logic that had less to do with sound operational planning and more to do with political desperation. The Wehrmacht did manage some initial breakthroughs, but supply constraints, Allied air superiority once the weather cleared, and the absence of decisive strategic reserves meant the effort could not be sustained. The high cost in manpower and material only underscored the tragedy. Even remarkable tactical audacity cannot compensate for hamstrung logistics and the absence of clear, uncensored counsel at the top. In considering these events, the moral complexities remain stark. Rundstedt's career and his July 1 outburst raise vexing questions about responsibility. He was, by many accounts, a professional soldier who believed in preserving striking power and in the classical methods of maneuver warfare. Yet he also operated within a regime responsible for atrocities whose machinery required the compliance of institutions, including the Wehrmacht. Orders such as the infamous Commando Order of 1942, which directed that captured commandos be executed rather than treated as prisoners of war, passed through chains of command in which professional officers did not always refuse to transmit and implement politically driven directives. Rundstedt's association with the regime and with the implementation of its directives on occasion complicates any simple reading of his authority and his later appeal to end the war. To respect his military judgment is not to erase the moral stain of obedience to criminal policy. After the war, these complexities were part of the post-war reckoning. Allied authorities interrogated and detained many senior German officers. Some faced trials. Others, like Rundstedt, were held as witnesses or suspects in broader investigations. Rundstedt himself was captured and interrogated. He suffered from illness in custody and, as the record indicates, never faced a full trial for the sorts of decisions and transmissions that might have implicated him more directly. Health considerations, the practicalities of prosecuting aging military leaders, and the priorities of the victorious powers influenced who was tried and who was not. The absence of a formal trial for some senior officers left unresolved debates about culpability and the moral calculus of professional service under a criminal government. For historians and moral philosophers alike, these unresolved matters remain uncomfortable reminders that legal processes cannot always neatly adjudicate complex responsibility. The final chapters of the Western Campaign reached a bleak, inexorable conclusion. By early 1945, Germany's ability to resist was exhausted. The Reich was collapsing on multiple fronts, its rail system destroyed by bombing and partisan attacks, its cities gutted by combat and hunger. Military decisions were increasingly desperate, and the political center continued to substitute ritual loyalty for adaptive strategy. The surrender in May 1945 closed the military chapter, but not the questions of responsibility, memory, and institutional learning. Rundstedt's own post-war life was quiet and, in some ways, illustrative. He lived his remaining years under the shadow of the contested record he left behind. A soldier respected for his operational mind, criticized for his complicity, and remembered for that curt telephone line that crystallized a moment of institutional failure. He died in 1953, leaving historians to parse his legacy. Some would argue that his assessment, that Germany had no realistic chance to reverse the strategic tide by July 1944, was accurate and might even have saved lives had it been acted upon. Others insist that willingness to serve in the Wehrmacht at all and to carry out its orders when they intersected with criminal policy cannot be washed away by any later counsel to cease the fighting. Both readings are necessary, neither wholly satisfies the demand for moral clarity. Beyond individual characters, the larger lesson endures. Institutions are not only collections of rules and hierarchies. They are also systems of incentives that shape incentives into truths. When the price of candor becomes exile or death, organizations will tend toward a comforting fiction. They will hear what keeps them safe, rather than what keeps them sane. That dynamic is not unique to 1944 Germany. It is visible in businesses that punish whistleblowers, in bureaucracies that reward spin over accuracy, and in any structure where truth-tellers are seen as liabilities. Rundstedt's phrase, delivered with the rawness of a professional facing collapse, was less an isolated moral utterance than a prognosis for systems that cannibalize their own capacity to perceive reality. This is not to render a deterministic moral formula, that honesty always prevails, or that removing truth-tellers will always produce ruin. History is messier. There are cases where politics must overrule military prudence, where difficult trade-offs are made under duress, and where good judgment is simply unavailable. But the German case of 1944 offers a cautionary aggregation. When selection pressures favor flatter-telling over clear counsel, the decision-making apparatus loses the very inputs that allow for adaptation. The human cost in such a case is catastrophic. Returning, finally, to the Chateau on that July evening, the image retains its sting. A field marshal whose life was spent drawing lines across maps had chosen, with economy and despair, to call the entire enterprise to an end. The line landed and then rang idle in its cradle. 2 days later, he was gone from the command. The theater would continue, bloodily and relentlessly, for months. The men who remained would face decisions made in the distorted mirror of political survival, and the war would grind on until the resources, and then the state itself, were spent. The cinematic moment of a shout into a telephone is seductive for historians and storytellers because it condenses into a single exchange a wider disaster of structure and spirit. But the deeper lesson is less theoretical and more procedural. If an organization is to survive and to act effectively in crisis, it must protect the channels through which inconvenient truth can flow. It must prize expertise even when expertise upsets political narratives. It must, in short, be built not on assurances, but on mechanisms that reward accurate assessment and tolerate the discomfort of bad news. In the end, the story is not simply about one harshly delivered sentence. It is about what that sentence revealed. A military culture stripped of its capacity to absorb reality, and a political culture determined to punish the messenger. Those conditions turned a tactical and operational problem into a moral and institutional catastrophe. For leaders and managers today, the image is a clear warning. When you punish honesty, you rob yourself of correction. When you silence those who see things plainly, you condemn your institution to the slow mathematics of decline. If you found this account thought-provoking, share your perspective in the comments. Was Rundstedt's call an act of conscience, a political misstep, or both? And if you want more deep dives into moments where decision-making and moral choice collide, subscribe and explore our related episodes where small decisions remade history.